All right, we're good.
All right, happy Wednesday, friends. So it's week 6 of Nature's Not Canceled from the Watershed Nature Center. However, today we're not at the Watershed Nature Center. We're at a really cool wetland here in Madison County, and we're joined by our colleague Sarah Vogt from HeartLands Conservancy. She's the conservation manager there, and she's been gracious enough to share some insight and some cool things about Arlington Wetlands. So wetlands, as you know, if you paid attention to the quiz on Monday, hope you're taking the quiz, are really cool habitats that are among the most biodiverse on Earth. And not only are they home for wildlife, they also do all sorts of things for us humans. They soak up stormwater, they store carbon in the soil, they help manage and mitigate floods, and they increase resilience, and of course, they're beautiful. Now, you might think, oh my gosh, it's raining, look at them. So one of my favorite phrases from an environmental educator friend of mine is, there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothing options. So, you know, we're here in our galoshes and our rain boots, and I encourage you to get out. Also, as long as it's not dangerous, the rain can be a phenomenal opportunity to get out and explore wildlife. Wildlife love the rain, especially frogs and turtles and other critters that love wetlands. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, and she's going to share a little bit about this special place, Heartland's role in this special place, and then we're going to go on a bit of a guided walk to see what we can see. Sarah?
Yeah. Okay, so we're near Pontoon Beach, and we're in what is called the American Bottom. It's the flat bottom land area between the Illinois Bluffs and the Mississippi River. So this is one of the widest floodplains in the whole Mississippi River. So it's a unique space, and yeah. So if you imagine what this place looked like before European settlement, it looked a lot different than it does today. You know, after the last ice age carved our rivers and streams, the American bottom would have been filled with lakes, ponds, sloughs, and it would have looked more like this artist's drawing of the American bottom than the current way it looks today. So here you can see the main channel, but there's also all of these lakes and back channels, and this even where there's not water would have been really wet, marshy areas. So this area has changed so dramatically now. When you drive down 255, which runs through the American bottom, you know, you see a lot of development, you see all these fields, so it's changed a lot. It's estimated that in Illinois, before settlement, there was 9.4 million acres of wetlands.
Wow.
Yeah. And today, there are only about 900,000. So 25% of all land in Illinois was wetland, and now it's about 2.5% of all land in Illinois. We've lost 90% of the wetlands in Illinois.
So not sure if you got that right on the quiz, but that was on the quiz.
It was on the quiz. It's an astonishing number.
It is astonishing.
Yeah, so why did this happen? Why did we lose these wetlands? It's because of settlement. Early settlers, I love this quote from a report from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Wetlands were regarded as swampy lands that bred disease, restricted overland travel, impeded the production of food and fiber, and generally were not useful for frontier survival. So they hated the mosquitoes, they couldn't get their wagons through them, so wetlands began to be drained so that they could be used for agriculture and development. At first they started digging ditches to drain the water out. Then they came up with drainage tiles that were clay pipes that are laid under the ground. The water flows into the clay pipe and then out to the ditch or the stream. So water is getting off the land very quickly. Those are still used today. They're now made of plastic. And then other ways we changed or got rid of wetlands is through levees to control flooding. And then finally in the early 1900s, the lock and dam system on the Mississippi River was huge. And it was done because, you know, the river did change a lot. It wiggled back and forth through the landscape. Different parts would be, the shallow and the deep would switch places a lot. Well, with the lock and dam system, the height or the depth of the water was kept consistent and the navigation channel remained unchanged. So that is where our wetlands have gone. Now in our current society, we're starting to take a different view of wetlands and how beneficial they can be. And there's been a big push for restoration and preservation of the few wetlands that are left. So this Arlington Wetlands is one site where we were able to purchase the land, restore the wetland on it, and now it's owned by Madison County, and it's a public park that anyone can come to. So let's walk out to the wetland area.
So what I love about, you know, I was telling Sarah before I got here that the only time that and I've lived in Madison County now for a long time, and the only time that I've been out here to Arlington Wetlands was when HeartLands did their jingle hike a few years ago, and one of the trees, I think a persimmon on the other side of this boardwalk, was one of the trees. But I'm grateful for it, and this is just so you know, this is an open to the public reserve. Again, owned, as Sarah said, by Madison County. It's phenomenal.
Since no one else was here when we got here, when we walk up to the water, I don't know since it's raining, but there might be some ducks and stuff that fly away when we walk up.
So I think this is her way of telling me to use my nature base because we need to see what we can see by using our nature base. Okay.
So the last week I was here and it was much warmer. So there were snakes out actually right over here.
Can you hear her?
I'll talk louder. So last week when I was here, it was much warmer, and when I walked up to this area, there was actually a couple of snakes that swam away. And no ducks today, but there usually are ducks and a group of trumper swans that reside here. It's a remnant channel or slough of the Mississippi River. It's actually very shallow, only a couple of feet, maybe 3 feet at the most deep, in the deepest spots. So you can see that there's hardly any open water. It's practically covered with vegetation. Wetlands are interesting in the fact that the deeper the water, actually the less plant diversity there's going to be. So if the water here was actually a little bit shallower, there would be more kinds of plants. So these plants that you see growing here are arrowhead, are also called American lotus. They get a yellow flower. There's also duckweed and other kinds of aquatic plants here.
Each of those little, so when you see this, and you'll see it at Watershed too, the duckweed, it's the world's smallest little plant, right?
Yeah,
so each one
cute.
of those each one of those little dots that you see is actually a little individual plant.
Yeah, and it has a little tiny root.
Yes, you know, some of the smartest botanists I know call these guys cute. So I just have to say they're so cute. And they're a good, yummy, nutritious food for a lot of wildlife too, like ducks and other things.
Yeah. So wetland, there's some red-winged blackbirds flying over there. Probably can't see them. So wetlands, there's a broad spectrum of what is defined as a wetland. Basically, wetlands can be permanently flooded or seasonally flooded, or they can just have very wet soil that is like saturated with water. They can occur in transition zones, like so the edge of a pond where there's lots of rushes or cattails or arrowhead like this, if that is considered a wetland, or they can be their own freestanding wetland. They have to have water-loving plants, or if you describe them a different way, plants that can tolerate a lot of water and not very much oxygen. So there are many different kinds of wetlands. This would be considered a marsh. There's standing water for the entire growing season here. There's always water. Sometimes if there's a period of drought, the water will get very low, and I've seen it completely dried out one time. So marshes occur around rivers and streams, or they're shallow ponds or sloughs. They look much like this. Then, can you see that swan line?
I know, that's where I'm trying. Let's see if I could zoom in at all.
Is that a swan? I couldn't see.
I can't.
That little white, yeah.
It's hard to tell from here. It's so far away.
I thought it was coming towards us for a minute, and I was excited, and then it turned.
Okay, so this is kind of one of the wettest wetlands. This is one step up from open water. If we imagine like moving up a hill, we can talk about other kinds of wetlands. So like slightly drier than this would be a wet meadow. Wet meadows they can have standing water, but not very much, not very often, but they usually have soil that is just full of water, completely saturated. And so those have lots of sedge grasses, bulrushes. They can have a few flowers, some ferns, things like blue iris, swamp milkweed, rose mallow, things like that.
Hibiscus, native hibiscus.
Yeah, native hibiscus, yeah. And they support a diverse amount of reptiles, amphibians, and birds. Then an equivalent of a marsh, but forested, would be a swamp. In Illinois, we find those at the very bottom, the southernmost part of the state, like the Cache River area, LaRue, Pine Hills. So those are swamps. Those are easily defined by tupelo and bald cypress trees. Then drier is a floodplain forest. We have those around here. They are forests around rivers that are seasonally flooded. So the trees there can withstand short periods of flooding, days or weeks even, but they could not sustain a whole season or a whole year of flooding. They're trees like maple, cottonwood, sycamore, ash, but they're very rich soils and rich habitats. And then there's a couple of kinds of wetlands that we wouldn't really find around here. There's seeps, where the water literally seeps out of the ground like a spring, kind of. They're found at the bottom of hills or cliffs, and you'll find the water flowing out. If the water is very alkaline, then it's called a fen. So those are very rare. I think there's like 125 of them in the United States.
Wow.
Or something like that. Then the last kind of wetland is a bog. That is where the water is very acidic. It's a basin where the water is very acidic. Those aren't around here either, but there are some in northern Illinois, and they are very interesting habitat. They have carnivorous plants, like pitcher plant, and it's where you find like wild blueberry and cranberry. Yeah. So let's talk about, now that we've covered, what do you have, Sheila? Do you want to show us?
Yeah.
I
What
found
did
a
you?
little friend, a denizen of the wetland. I don't know my snail species ID very well, but I'm sure he will be food for somebody, right? So part of the food chain.
Yeah.
I was going to say, when you were talking about swamps and bottomland forests, you know, one of the things also on our quiz, if you took it, had to do with just documenting the number of wetlands in the U.S. And one of the reasons why it's hard is because, sorry, that's my phone. One of the reasons why it's hard is, think of bottomland forests. Think of how hard it would be for a satellite to track that bottomland forest, right? So especially with leaf-on imagery, if you do a satellite in the summer with leaf-on imagery. So a lot of wetlands in the U.S. are likely undercounted. There is such a thing as the National Wetland Inventory, but even, you know, the people that are in charge of that, USGS and other agencies, will say that it's probably a real underestimate of the number of functional wetlands. And they don't, of course, exist just on public property like this. They exist in private lands. So it's important for everybody, whether you're, whether you're a landowner in a municipality or a county government responsible for a fantastic place like this, or a private homeowner, to really understand the functions that these places have. And as Sarah was saying, they were so misunderstood and undervalued and underappreciated and even hated.
Yeah.
You know, when European settlers, all of our ancestors came over and tried to live in this land. And now, I have no wood, but knock on wood, they are starting to be understood. There's so much more to appreciate and understand about them, but they're starting to be understood for all the ways that they benefit us.
We're starting to learn and utilize them and capture their value more. So one of the ways that they have value is by capturing stormwater. So, you know, we have lots of problems with flash flooding, stormwater flooding, even Mississippi River flooding. So these wetlands are huge stormwater storage. They act like sponges almost. And they can capture all this rainwater, hold it for a longer period of time, and then slowly release the water into the groundwater supply or out into the other streams, but slowly release it instead of all at once.
Let's keep walking.
Keep walking?
See what we can see. It's really quite beautiful out here. It feels like, even though we can see and hear the highway in the background,
we're very close to 255.
We're very close to 255, but part of me, whenever I come to a place like this, part of me almost imagines a dinosaur coming out of the it feels like just a different place and a different time. I see some of the American lotus blossoms budding. They haven't blossomed yet, but there's tons of buds. This will be very pretty when they're all in bloom.
And then around the edges, there's a lot of button bush around the edge. So, which is a water-loving shrub, and it gets this really beautiful, unique,
globular,
a white ball flower.
and it's a butterfly magnet.
Yeah.
So buttonbush, yeah, there is a ton here. I remember seeing it. It makes a great landscape plant for rain gardens or low-lying areas of your yard.
Yeah.
And in the summer, like Sarah said, beautiful white globular flowers that butterflies of all sorts will just glob over.
Yeah. So should we talk a little bit about nutrient capturing?
Yes.
Okay, so wetlands are also great at capturing nutrients. Some people refer to them as the kidneys of the ecosystem.
Also on the quiz.
Yes, it was.
And it's because, well, we'll start with nitrogen and phosphorus. Those are two really common pollutants for streams. So when the water flows into the wetlands carrying the nitrogen and phosphorus, because it slows the water down, a lot of that is able to settle to the bottom. So it's stored in the sedimentation, and then some of it is taken up by the plants and converted to parts of the plant, or also a huge part of the nutrient capture in wetlands is the bacteria that actually live here. They'll feast on the nitrogen and convert it to better compounds. And then carbon, just like the trees and prairie grasses, these plants capture carbon, or carbon dioxide, convert it to oxygen, and they're storing that carbon in their roots and their leaves. And you may know, like in a prairie or in the forest, at the end of the fall, when the plants die or the leaves die, some of that carbon is released back in, but a lot of it is stored in the roots. Well, there's some research that wetlands are actually more efficient at storing carbon than other places because the rate of decay is so slow. So when these arrowheads die, they kind of will sink to the bottom of the wetlands so that carbon will be stored longer. That also means a properly functioning wetland will eventually fill completely in. It will take a very long time, but eventually all that plant material, all that sedimentation, it'll get shallower and shallower throughout the time. Let's see. Well, there's also, I mean, this is great for recreation.
Yeah. Yes.
Wildlife viewing. There's also a lot of research being done on wetlands, ongoing research. Even on sites that we have that have wetlands, almost every site HeartLands owns has a wetland on it.
Yep.
We have ongoing researchers working on chorus frogs right now and plafonetary warbler.
That's awesome. One of the things, I know we're running a little short on time, but one of the things as Sarah was talking that I find interesting is, remember when she said, years ago at European settlement, these places were wastelands. They were undervalued and they were hated. And now it's interesting as we get to know them more. They're actually starting to be valued with dollar signs too. So there's such things as wetland mitigation banks, which basically means for all that carbon that they're storing and other benefits, stormwater management, that's worth something on the marketplace. So that's an interesting trend that can actually not only, I mean, obviously the value of this place is beyond dollar signs, but to have it actually be worth dollars that can be traded on the market is a good trend. I think the last thing that we wanted to at least touch on is wetlands are in the news a lot. So, especially now, the Clean Water Act and many pieces of legislation protect places like this, but it really comes down to the definition of what is a wetland. And some wetlands in certain parts of the year, in certain seasons, are not going to look like this. They're not going to look like a thriving place, but yet there's still a functioning wetland. So it's important that all of us, citizens, voters, legislators, policymakers, land use decision makers really understand what a wetland is. So it's not just for our own, curious brains and knowledge. It actually comes into play when it comes to really understanding the policies and the laws that allow these places to thrive and allow these places to stay protected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any closing thoughts or reflections in addition to encouraging people to come here throughout the year, because it's going to be an interesting
Yeah, it changes seasonally.
Yes.
And just like Watershed, there are so many birds here.
Yep.
So if you are interested in bird watching, this is a great place to come and study birds.
Excellent.
And
All
I
right.
don't think I have anything else.
Okay.
All
Well, thanks you guys so much for joining us. Come experience Arlington Wetlands sometime this year. Wetlands, of course, is at the heart of what Watershed Nature Center is all about. Our wetland lagoons are literally the heart of our center, not only physically, but in so many other ways as well. So do all you can to learn about them. Thanks for joining us. Have a great week.